said, would love to introduce the guy who wrote the book on airflow, quite literally, Bas from the Astronomer team, to start talking about airflow testing. So Bas, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So the next just under an hour, I'll talk a little bit about testing, and I'll start sharing my screen first. I'll keep this open because I'm gonna switch between screens. Okay. So testing airflow to bulletproof your code. Don't take it literally, but we hope to, after this presentation and a couple of questions, that you feel a bit more certain that your code works in production before you deploy it there. So it's a little agenda for tonight. So a little bit about general testing in Python, and then I'll dive into the airflow testing with a couple of topics from ranging from simple, so unit testing individual operators, down to complete environments, so a bit more complex. So first, before we start testing with airflow itself, a couple of slides on testing in Python. There's different ways to do this. But Python has a built-in framework called unit test. So you just import unit test and you're good to go with a couple of ways to test your code. There's many other frameworks as well besides unit test, but those are all third-party. PyTest is highlighted in bold over here because it's a very popular third-party framework to use. It's also used by Airflow open source. And in the next couple of slides and examples that I'll show, I'll also use PyTest. So you just pip install PyTest and then you're good to go with that. And on the right side here, I have a directory tree. This is the typical project structure for testing. So you generally have a folder with DAGs, maybe some custom code, and tests follow the same structure there. So you have a DAGs directory there, maybe a package directory. And generally, a good project structure mimics the structure of your actual project. So what does a test look like? Basically, a unit test validates a certain piece of logic. So let's say you implemented a multiply method. It takes two variables A and B, and you multiply them, and you want to be sure that your multiply method indeed multiplies correctly. So we give it numbers 2 and 3, and we check using the assert keyword if the result is indeed 6. So this is a very simple test. One thing to note here with PyTest, you have to prefix your test with test underscore, and then PyTest will be able to auto discover those. So after this, we'll dive a bit more into how to do this with Airflow specifically. One reason why I like PyTest so much over unit test is well, for a couple of reasons, but one of them is that they support these things called fixtures. And I think they give you a bit more flexibility than the setup and teardown methods in unit test, because they are basically like reusable Lego blocks that you can use in your test. So you define a method, you annotate it with PyTest fixture, and then whenever you use it as an argument in your test, then PyTest knows, hey, this person or this test will take the argument A or the fixture A here and use that. You can use that fixture throughout your tests. So this example is very, very simple, but as your tests and your project grows bigger, these PyTest fixtures, they can be reused throughout tests, and that gives you a lot of flexibility. So whenever I start an Airflow project, I generally start with this test, the DAG integrity test. And I see this go by many names, DAG validity test or check or integrity test. Name it whatever you like, but it looks like this, and it's basically a simple sanity check on your DAGs. And it will filter out a couple of basic things like required arguments. So if you say you forgot the DAG ID on your DAG, then this will fill. So the test will instantiate this thing called a DAG bag. And a DAG bag is it's kind of like an internal Airflow class. You, as a DAG developer, never really use this, but the scheduler in Airflow internally uses this to parse DAG files, and we can use that in our test to basically use the same logic. So whenever you call a DAG bag, it loads all the DAGs in your DAGs directory, and it doesn't really fail straight away if there's an error in your DAG. And the reason for that is it first scans over all files, and it collects the errors basically, instead of failing on the very first error. So we have to assert after instantiating DAG bag if there are no import errors. And this, like I said, it's kind of like a sanity check and will filter out a lot of errors. So let me show you what that looks like. So I have my DAG integrity check here with the code that I just showed. And if I have any simple error in my DAG, so here I have a hello world DAG, and let's say I make a cycle which is not a valid DAG, it should be acyclic, so this is not allowed in Airflow, and I run my test, then it should fail saying something like you're not allowed to have a cycle.
Hey, Bas.
Yeah.
Could you increase the font size just a little bit?
So my bad.
Yep, no worries.
Come on. View. Photos. Come on, plus. Let me just, does this work? This is not really working. Photo was command plus.
It might be in view appearance.
Maybe the presentation mode works out.
Oh, there we go.
You don't see the full window, but hopefully it is readable. So basically you have a DAG bag, and then you insert if there's no import errors. Then I have to exit this again. In the run. And at the bottom, if you scroll down at the bottom of your log file, if there's an error in your test, you'll always see something useful where there's an E, and here it says assertion error, cycle detected in DAG. And that's because the DAG bag loaded and it detected a cycle there, which is one of the checks that a DAG bag performs. So just to give another example, let's say you, for whatever reason, forgot your DAG ID. So now we have a nameless DAG. Again, this is not allowed by, this is a required argument, so this should fail. And again, our test failed. You scroll down to the bottom, and then you have to scroll a little bit through the log files, but there's a hint here which says missing one required argument, DAG ID. So this test filters out a lot of silly programming mistakes which you might make. And for myself, when I'm programming, this filters out like 80% of my mistakes. So it's super useful to start your project with it. On top of that, if you like to perform additional checks in your DAGs, you can add some sort of conventions. So for example, if you want all your DAGs to include to have a tag, you can perform additional checks on all the DAGs in your DAG bag. And the way to do that is on your DAG bag, there's an attribute called DAGs. and you can basically, for every DAG, check certain things like, does it have a tag? So again, if we go back to our code, say this thing has no tags, and we run our Dagger integrity test. Wait a couple of seconds. And then says hello world in this file has no tags. So that's how you can apply or enforce certain conventions in your project. So this for me filters out like 80% of my my silly programming mistakes. So it's probably one of the most valuable tests I have in my project. So with that, let's go into specific operators or hook testing with the help of unit testing. So the most simplest way to test an operator in Airflow is basically by calling execute on it. And if this is, gives you a workable test that depends a little bit on the operator, but the bash operator, whatever is printed on the standard out, is returned in a variable, and then you can just check if the result is indeed what you expect it to be. So in this case, I have a bash operator. I say bash command is echo hello, and then hello will be returned in this result, and we assert if the result is indeed hello. One thing to note here, execute requires an argument named context, but you can leave it empty. But we'll look at this later. So this is the very simplest test you can do, or unit test you can do with Airflow. This doesn't really require a meta story, so you can just copy paste this script and run it. So a little bit more complex because we're going to add a execution date, which is one of the items in your context task instance context in Airflow. So if you want to do anything with your execution date in your task, you can provide one in your test just by hand. So we give it a date time of January 1st. We format it like day, month, year, and we check is the result indeed January 1st, 21st. So this still works. The point where this sort of basic unit testing fails is when you want to do templating. And the reason for that, let me show you an example first. So let's say you want to test your bash operator again. You say echo hello today, echo today is the templated execution date. We give the execution date here, and we expect to see this string, but actually it returns literally the templated string without the templating applied. And the reason this fails is because execute is, it doesn't do the templating. When you run a task in Airflow, there's a lot of things happening. And execute is basically called at the very end after the templating is already done. So if you just call execute, there will be no templating. So if we like that, like to do to test our templates, we need a little bit more code. So we can't call execute anymore. But there's a couple of things happening when you run a task. And like I said, templating is one of them, and a couple of levels of abstraction higher in the Airflow API. There's this method called run, which includes templating and calling pre-execute, execute, post-execute, those kind of methods. So we can use that to actually run a task, including the templating. The thing to note here is task.run is actually used to run multiple tasks in Airflow. In testing, typically you just want to run one single test or task to validate if that's correct. So that's why I always align the start and the end date in my tests. This This way of testing is a little bit more involved because you need an Airflow metastore. So to set it up, you could run Airflow DB init, and in your home directory, that will create a SQLite database called Airflow DB. So we go to the terminal, run Airflow DB init. Let me open up the project view first. So we'll create a SQLite database if you have no specific configurations. And yeah, here it is. So that will create an airflow.db file. And this is a SQLite metastore, and you can use this in your tests. By default, this will go to your home directory, so that's probably not so ideal. So generally, I set my Airflow home environment variable to I point that to my project directory, so it ends up in my project instead of my own home directory. But still, this is not really ideal. So if you were to instantiate the Airflow metastore for every test, that's yeah, a bit impractical. So what I like to do with the help of PyTest, I have this magical fixture in a file called conftest.py. And this fixture I can use throughout all my Airflow tests because I set this argument auto use is true. And what this will do is it will actually reset the Airflow metastore for every test session. So that means every time I start PyTest, it will reset the Airflow metastore. And ideally, yeah, you always want your test to be sort of isolated from everything else. So I set a couple of defaults, for example, to not include default connections, not include any example DAGs. So I have an empty Airflow metastore, and I can safely query the metastore without anything being already in there. So this fixture you place in a file named conftest.py. And this is a little bit of PyTest magic. There's this convention in PyTest that anything in a conftest.py file is read when you run a PyTest session. And that's automatically, you can use anything in here in your throughout your tests. So if I have, for example, this templating example that I just showed, and I run this, you actually see a lot of output. All these lines. This is actually a result of Airflow resetting the Airflow metastore. Then it runs a test. And optionally, you can also remove the metastore afterwards. So this PyTest fixture helps you in the sense that you don't have to manually instantiate an Airflow metastore anymore during your test. You can just include this in your project, and it will automatically create a metastore for your tests wherever your Airflow code needs it. Yeah, we'll clean up the files. So in order to use templating, for templating, Airflow needs a couple of things besides a metastore, and that's all. One of them is also a DAG. So whenever you test anything with templating, you also need to instantiate a DAG. And here I run dag.clear. That basically clears any task instances. Basically, if you have a metastore and you run a task with test, it will leave some state in there. So that's why I always call dag.clear in my test. And lastly, task.run will not return any output like task.execute. And the reason for that is task.run actually it can be responsible for running multiple tasks. And as a result, it doesn't return any value. So I have to do a little trick here. And that is whatever I'm echoing with my bash command, I write that to a file. And the file is actually a temporary file, so that will be automatically cleaned up after my test. So with PyTest, you get a couple of magic fixtures, one of them being temp path, so you can use that. It's like automatically available in your tests. So I create a temporary output file, and I echo my whatever will be created here into this output file. And then to assert the result, I will read that output file and check if that's indeed what I expect it to be. So that's how you can write a unit test on an operator with templating. So unit test with mocking gets a bit more complex here, but sometimes you want to mock things, and that's typically when you want to talk to any external system in your test. Typically, you run a test on your laptop, and you don't have access to any, say, production database or production systems. So in order to keep your tests, basically able to run on your laptop, one of the ways to do that is with the help of mocking. And mocking allows you to replace functionality with fake behavior. One, like I said, to avoid calling any external systems, but also to, you might want to use it to return a predictable outcome. If you have, for example, an API that you're calling and that always returns some sort of random result, you could use mocking to return one single predictable outcome. So mocking actually works by importing it first from the unit test library. There's also a mocking utility in PyTest, which is kind of like a wrapper around this thing. But yeah, in order to not make it too complex, I'll just import it from here. And then you call mock.patch. And you need a little bit of knowledge of the internals when you start mocking, because you need to know at what point or what method is responsible for making a call to an external system. So if we have, yet again, a batch operator that we would like to test, and we would like to test it, a template where it would go in a real Airflow setup. It would go to the meta store, check for a variable named employees, which we don't have in our test suite. So then we need to know where in Airflow this, what method is responsible for making the call to the meta store, and that's this method. So we call mock.patch on it, and that will basically replace its functionality. And we can, in this case, give it a return value of these three employees. So whenever we run this test, instead of Airflow going to the meta store and saying, hey, give me a variable named employees, it will actually just return this Python array. And that allows us to run our test on our laptop without the need to connect to any production system. There's different ways to specify mocks or to patch. One, like I showed in the example in the previous slide, as a context manager. So you say with mock.patch, and then you do something with that mocked variable. Once you start mocking multiple things, it's not ideal because you get multiple levels of context managers, and that's your code goes a little bit unreadable. So whenever I have more than one mock, I typically prefer to use the decorated version, which you can do by setting a mock.patch decorator on your test function. And might not be super intuitive, but the last decorator is actually the first argument on your function. And this avoids having multiple nested levels. So here's another example, basically exact same functionality. You have a batch operator where you want to print a variable named employees. And this is another way you can do it with a decorator. You patch the environment. And another way to set variables in Airflow is by an environment variable called Airflow var, and then the name of the variable. And you can give it this thing. And again here, so this will replace the Airflow functionality where it goes to the meta store, and instead give it, this return value. So unit testing with Docker. So once we're done with mocking, sometimes there are just certain things which don't allow for mocking. Sometimes you need a lot of knowledge of the internals of a certain system, or there's just no nice mocking library available for whatever it is that you're testing with. So one of the options to work around that is with the help of Docker. And Docker allows us to create, basically run a real system that we can use in our tests. The code gets a little bit lengthy, but I'll break it down. So for running Docker in my tests, there's a couple of plugins you can use with PyTest. I tried a few, but PyTest Docker tools stuck with me, and I've been using it for a while now. And this is it's kind of like a PyTest plugin that allows you to run certain Docker statements, like create a container and work with a Docker container in your tests. So I'll break down this long piece of code here. I hope this is large enough. Oh. Basically, you start with importing the plugin. Fetch allows you to specify an image, and then container allows you to specify a container. And this is, again, a PyTest fixture. So if you add it as an argument on your test, PyTest will know, hey, there's a container fixture here, and it will know to create a container for this test. Then to connect with this Postgres container, normally you would specify a connection in your Airflow metastore, which again, we have an empty metastore throughout our test, so we don't really want that. So we would mock out the calls to the metastore and return a fake or dummy connection, which now points to our container. And this way we have a running Postgres container, and we can run the Postgres operator on that. So the Postgres operator here will run a statement to create a table, insert 4 rows. And the Postgres operator doesn't allow for returning any values. So we have a second operator called the SQL value check operator, which can return one single value. And we use that to check if indeed the count of the number of rows is indeed 4. So if I run this in here, I can run the test. I have to be a little bit quick here. You'll see that it creates a Docker container for my test, and it's pretty quick because the image is already on my machine. So it creates a container from this image, basically calls the Postgres operator on it, and then calls the test. The SQL value check operator on that to check if there's indeed 4 rows inserted by the Postgres operator. So that's how you can check against a real database in this case with the help of Docker. So this still goes into individual operators. So sometimes you would like to test, to do some integration testing. So at some point you're done with testing individual operators and you would like to know if multiple operators together actually do what you expect it to do. So just like task.run, you also have a DAG.run method. And this allows you to run a complete DAG in a test. So inside my test here, I specified a DAG which reflects this thing. And I want to ensure that when it's a weekend, for example, that it actually executes this task. So then I have to make sure that my starting date here, because that's the date for which my DAG will run, is a weekend day. Then I can run the DAG and I can perform all sorts of checks if the state was successful and if certain tasks were either skipped or if they were successful. So you need a little bit of knowledge of the internals of Airflow to understand that there's, for example, a state attribute on your DAG run. But yeah, once you have that, you can check if this DAG runs correctly from within the test. So typically, I would write a lot of tests for individual operators, and then I would write this test after that just to pull a little bits and pieces of a typically larger DAG to validate if the connectivity between multiple operators works correctly. So at this point, we wrote a lot of code, but sometimes, you just want to test against a real system. Ideally, you have more than one system to do that. So you don't really want to deploy into a production system and trigger the DAG and see if it works. But yeah, if you want to have a second system or maybe a third or a fourth, you would set those up. And to bring your DAG from just a branch into production, this is typically what people do. They have multiple branches, each reflecting to a specific or corresponding to a specific Airflow deployment. And then via pull request, you would merge from one branch into another, all the way into production until you run in your production environment via a series of checks. So, and then your development environment or test or acceptance environment would typically mimic your production environment, but the development environment is typically a very small environment, just able to run your tests, whereas the production environment is generally a lot larger to able to run your full workflows. But then the Airflow CLI, it can help us in two ways. There's a command called Airflow tasks test, and that will allow you to run a single test or single task, for a given execution date. So in order to run this, let's say you have your DAG, hello world. You can call Airflow tasks test, and then your DAG ID, and a task you would like to test for a given execution date. And we'll actually perform a single run of that task. So in this case, it prints world, which is over here. You can use this locally just for quickly running a single task. I have also used it in production to place a breakpoint in my code, but it's kind of bad practice, but it can help you out in certain cases. So this allows you to run a task from the command line instead of the UI. Then besides task, you can also run a complete DAG with the command line, and this will use a so-called debug executor, basically to do the same thing, but after completing a task, it will go to the next task and run the whole thing from your command line So it might be helpful for testing. That brings us to the last topic, CI/CD. So how do you run tests in your CI/CD? Generally, I have a couple of things. So first are static checks. These are typically things like Flake 8 or Black or Pylint, and these check more like conventions on your code. So if you stick to the Python conventions, for example, and these are run first because these are very quick and small to run. And then I run all my tests because these are typically a bit bigger to run and take longer. And once this works successfully, then you would deploy your code. So I have a example here. This is with GitHub Actions. We'll share this code after the session with you, so you can copy paste this into your own project if you would like to. So whenever you push code, there's an on push keyword here, it would perform a couple of checks. So first static checks, and only once those complete, you would run your PyTest suite in here. It will run all your tests, and if anything fails in here throughout your test, then it will fill here. And then if you have another step here for doing a deployment, that will be skipped. So that's how you can run your tests in a CI/CD system. We'll share the slides and everything afterwards. There's a couple of links that are referred to in what I just said in the last half hour. But generally, I suggest to read the PyTest documentation. It's pretty well written and very useful for knowing all the ins and outs of PyTest. For running tests with the help of Docker, there's this plugin, pretty useful. And I always find the Airflow source code always also a good source for inspiration on how to write tests. So if you're a bit stuck on say mocking, it could help to go to the Airflow source code and get some inspiration there. And that's it.
Wow, that was great, Bas. That was very, very deep technical content. There's a lot of questions here. We're going to do our best to get through them, but I don't know if we'll have enough time to get through all of them because we only have about 15 minutes left. So I'll just read them to you, and you can take your best crack at it.
Yeah.
So one question that a few people have asked is, when you're doing unit testing in Airflow, should you focus more on unit testing the DAGs or unit testing the operators? Like where should the emphasis be?
Yeah. Generally, a unit test is testing a single piece of logic. So I think it naturally fits in more with testing individual operators. And yeah, testing a complete DAG I would consider more of an integration test. But regardless, whatever name you give it, I think testing individual operators, for me personally, already gives say a very large confidence that my workflows run correctly, and the integration of multiple tests is generally something I do at the end. And it's typically also what you do a little bit more with a DTAP environment, where you check if a complete workflow runs correctly.
Yeah. And then a follow-up question to that some Ricardo asked is, is it enough to just put your DAGs through CI/CD, or do you also recommend running them in an actual Airflow environment like you have here?
Yeah, it's a bit of it depends question or answer. Sorry. I think a CI/CD is that's mandatory. I never advise to copy paste your DAGs into environment. So first, CI/CD, and then depending on a lot of factors. For example, how big your team is and how many environments they have the bandwidth for to manage. Some companies or some teams decide to just go for 2 environments, so a development and a production environment. But generally, yeah, the bigger the team, the more environments you see.
Yeah, for sure. I would echo that. I think that after you get to a certain scale, it makes sense to have dedicated infra just for development. But if it's just 1 or 2 users, right, that might be overkill. It really depends on what you're doing. If you only have a couple of users, but you're writing very business critical workloads, then it might make sense to invest in a proper test environment. Cool. So another question is a little bit about the content itself. What do you need to run it? I think this will be clear when you send it out, but do you need to have Astronomer running? Do you need to just have a couple Python things on your local? Like, what do you need to run the content you share?
So we'll share this project after the session. But basically, it's all vanilla Airflow, what I just showed. You need Apache Airflow installed, obviously, and then you need PyTest. That's the very beginning. And once you go into things like Docker, then there's a plugin you need to install. But this can run on any system. There's nothing Astronomer specific here.
Perfect. Awesome.
Except for this screenshot.
So Joe Mack is asking, first off, he says, great presentation. He thanks you, but he's asking, would it be possible to run DAG tests and validate the next few expected execution and run dates? For example, if we have a daily DAG, can we set up tasks that asserts, let's say, the next 3 execution and run rates? This would make it easier for devs that are having a tough time making sure Airflow runs at the date it's supposed to.
Right. So if I get it correctly, you want to run a DAG for 3 specific dates to validate if that works correctly.
Yeah, to make sure the next couple of expected dates are templated incorrectly.
Okay. Yeah, there is. Go back a little bit.
Yeah, Joe. One thing also, while Bass pulls that up, is with Airflow 2.2, which is due out, I believe next week or the week after, so relatively soon. There's going to be some more ways to schedule your DAG that'll make it so that it'll be more clear that when a DAG is going to run on its expected date. So that is going to be made easier for all users in the very near future. Back to you, Bass.
Yeah, sure. So both the task.run that I showed here and a little bit down in this part, DAG.run, they both take are responsible for running a range of either tasks or DAGs for a range of dates. So in my tests, I generally fix these to the same date so that I run only one single instance. But if you give the end date, set the end date to sometime later than the starting date, Airflow actually figures out with the schedule how many runs to execute, and that should help your use case.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm gonna keep feeding this to you, Bass.
Sure, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, Eric is asking, for the code samples that you showed them using the Python operator. Can you do similar tests using the Taskflow API and the new decorators as you've shown here?
In the end, it's all Python code. So simple answer is yes. I don't have an example lying around, unfortunately. So I can maybe add one to the repository afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
But just like your normal Python operator. I think if you need a test immediately, like I said, you go to the Airflow source code. It's always a good source of inspiration for me for seeing how the core developers test stuff in Airflow.
This is a general question from a few people that I've asked, but when you're testing something that's interacting with data, so with something like BigQuery, Redshift, et cetera, are there any best practices for how you should incorporate some sort of data aware tests inside of your Airflow tests?
Yeah, it's a bit, there's not really one straight answer. it gets it's a bit tricky, but generally I would try to get a little sample data set if it's not PI data, of course. So if there's no privacy sensitive data, that's okay to stick into your project. You could use that to say you have a little data set of 10 or 100 rows. That's not very big. You could stick that into your project and incorporate that in your tests. If not, then you're probably gonna have to look at DTAP environments where you keep data outside your Airflow project and run in a live Airflow scenario, but maybe in a bit smaller setting than in your production environment.
Makes total sense.
And there's also other tools for doing data testing or data quality testing, like Great Expectations. I think the Airflow guides have the astronomer website has an Airflow guide there.
Yep. Yeah. And those SQL check operators you showed are actually really helpful as well, especially for that baseline stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. We have a couple of guides on using those as well. Cool. So we have another question here. Give me 1 second. Are there any recommendations for when you're trying to run these sorts of tests, but you're generating your DAGs dynamically? So if you're doing something like a DAG factory or a task generator, right? Maybe reading off a list or something. How would you handle testing in those sorts of scenarios?
That's a good question.
Yeah, it's a really good question.
I think I would probably try to resemble your production setting as closely as possible. I don't know, what your what's the result of your dynamic DAG? So if it's a list or a query somewhere, but I would try to mimic your real scenario as much as possible, if that's a good answer. I hope that answers.
No, I think so. I think that did answer it. That's a really hard one, right? Because it's also tough to know what your DAG's gonna look like every day. Cool. So let's see here. What's another question folks have? Do you have any thoughts on how you'd want to test the structure of a DAG as part of your CI system? So you want to make sure that a user doesn't fundamentally change the structure of a DAG too much. How would you go about testing something like that?
So it sounds more like a sort of almost like an admin convention that an administrator would make, that your DAGs are not allowed to change too much.
Yeah.
That's the only thing I can say about testing the structure of a DAG is, in the beginning of my the presentation, you have this DAG bag that allows you to pull out all the DAG objects from your code, and you can apply certain conventions here. So say you can test if there are any tags in this example, but this is where you can also check on certain structural things maybe. If you prefer that.
Cool. And then another question that I think I've had this one before. We should maybe publish one of these, but when you're talking about the internals of Airflow, do you have a cheat sheet of the most kind of important functions to think about when you're thinking about testing? I feel like that's a very common ask. Maybe we should publish one of those.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I don't have a cheat sheet. That's the short answer. But typically execute, that's the method that every operator implements. So generally calling this thing is step number 1. But in some scenarios, like I showed with templating, that doesn't work. So that's where you have to resort to calling not execute, but run. But I don't really have a clear, nice overview of which classes and which methods to call. I hope this presentation gives you some guidance there.
Yeah, that should be it'd be a good follow-on blog post, right?
yeah, true.
Yeah, and maybe we can get one of those scheduled to the backlog as well. Awesome. I think we have time for one more question, sure. And then we can kind of handle the rest of them asynchronously. So I guess, so Ricardo's asking, is there a way to mock S3 to test the DAG that uses S3 operators or hooks? How would you recommend doing that?
Yeah, there's, I can't remember if I've ever mocked S3 myself, but I've worked with Moto. Yes, Moto library. And in my experience, it's pretty decent in mocking a lot of AWS services. And I think they had, so this is a pretty decent library in that can mock all sorts of AWS services. They don't support it 100%, but in my experience, it works pretty decent. So there's a mock S3 decorator. Hopefully, they actually have an example here where you can mock any calls to S3. So I strongly suggest you check out the Moto library. And this way you don't need to connect to any live Amazon account.
Awesome. Alrighty. I know there's still a lot of questions that we haven't got to yet. I wish we had more time, but with 5 minutes left, I think we'll have to bounce. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. All the content will be distributed to you all afterwards. Bas, thank you so much for going through this. This was awesome. I've never learned so much about airflow testing in such little time. Yeah, I think you're going to get a lot of requests after this. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
All right, everyone. Hope you enjoy the rest of your Tuesday.